Chapter 5. Gamergate itself. Now we're into Gamergate. But Gamergate itself is a huge, sprawling mess, and there aren't any good ways to break it down. A timeline would rapidly become an indecipherable mess, and unravelling claims and counterclaims is similarly unlikely to be productive, and likely to be terribly confusing to anyone not already aware of everything. Rather, I have decided to divide my explanations and examinations of Gamergate into looser areas. I have decided to explain and to examine those areas discreetly, so much as is possible, and to try and explain how Gamergate tied into, influenced, or was influenced by these issues. Necessarily, this also involves me presenting my interpretations and positions on these issues. I'm aware of my bias as a left libertarian type of person, and now you are too. Culture and politics. There's no question that Gamergate has been swept up into the culture war that has been going on in Western nations, but most especially America. A shallow analysis might conclude this to be a left-right conflict or one between conservatives and progressives. That same analysis tends to consider Gamergate to be right-wing and reactionary when nothing could be further from the truth. It is true that Gamergate is part of a more general exasperation with social justice warriors, and this same phenomenon of frustration and annoyance has fed the populist right. Gamergate, however, and much of the opposition to social justice warriors in general, comes from people who classify themselves as classical liberals or cultural libertarians. Someone like Bill Maher can hardly be described as right-wing. He has a consistently anti-PC and pro-free speech stance, and has run afoul of the same sorts of people. It's not just the right wing that takes a stand against the censorious attitudes and pseudoscience of the progressive left wing. There's a lot of liberals, free speech advocates, skeptics, and others on the more traditional left who are horrified by the threats the progressive left presents to art, expression, and dialogue. The right has latched onto this, as their attitudes and beliefs are now less popular and less present in society. Even so, when genuine liberals are being called names for being willing to stand up for icky speech, political or otherwise, something has gone wrong. The Baldwin tweet. Adam Baldwin's tweet on Gamergate coined the hashtag and the final name for the movement. It also gave the campaign a huge amount of exposure from his 250,000 followers. It brought it to the attention of a significant number of people, unfortunately, in hindsight, on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. As a rare conservative figure in Hollywood, his voice carried a reasonable amount of weight and influence in those quarters. While he was good for getting the word out at a time when games and conventional media were engaged in the creation of a false narrative, his involvement ultimately helped those against Gamergate. It helped them to paint it as a right-wing movement. Thanks to him, they were able to present it as part of a reactionary backlash against progressivism. In reality, it was more of a small L libertarian backlash against authoritarianism and corruption, and an assertion of genuine liberal principles. Having been noticed by and treated credibly by the right, little wonder that only right-wing media and celebrities, for the most part, would discuss it or take it seriously in such a polarized society. This did as much harm as good. Anti-censorship. While the main thrust of Gamergate was corruption and ethical breaches in the media, this cannot be disentangled from the virulently anti-censorship bent of both internet and gaming culture, which cross over enormously. This factor is further entangled since many of the journalists involved and many of the stories they have spun, which first earned gamers scorn, are attempts to censor. Their social and financial efforts to mark down and force game creators to bow to the hyper-PC agendas that they are pushing. The excuse given for this behaviour is often that it is criticism, but in practice it is an attempt to censor, control, and shame publishers and creators into changing what they are producing. The difference between criticism and censorship might be expressed as the difference between "I don't like this" and "this shouldn't exist." The latter is the position of the cultural critics like Anita Sarkeesian, who try to mobilize social shaming and an engaged and vocal minority to force companies into changing things. This attitude is then further expressed and pushed by large chunks of the gaming media, the betrayal of their audience, which bothers so many of them. To gamers, this all reeks of previous attempts to censor and control games. The scaremongering and moral panics are familiar. Only the content of the rhetoric has changed. A peculiarity of recent politics is that the left wing has become authoritarian and censorious, while the right wing has embraced its more libertarian side. This has shifted things to the point where free expression has become seen as a right-wing issue, and even derided by the left as free speech. This seems to have happened as left-wing ideas, or pseudo-left ideas, have become ascendant and have gained power, while right-wing viewpoints have lost power and authority. As right-wing ideas have become marginalised, they have gained an appreciation for the value of free expression, just as the left used to when its ideas were marginalised. Now that the pseudo-left are the ones with the power, they seem willing to pull the ladder up behind them and to deny others the rights they gained so much from. When we're talking about power here, we're not just talking about political power. Conservative forces are ascendant at the time of writing in both the US and UK. Social power, academic power, cultural power can all be just as strong or stronger in the current social paradigm. Social power determines acceptability, terms and rules that are self-enforcing, while government power has to be enforced. It's also worth noting the seeming paradox here. Companies have held the whip over the games media for many years through financial means, forcing them to write better reviews and to toe the line if they wanted early releases. In some ways, things have reversed to an extent, with games writers seeming to hold the whip over the companies. They're doing this via their social justice criticism, which terrifies companies and has them scrambling to be pleasing, most of the time. You'd think this might balance their power over each other somewhat, but instead, we seem to get the worst of both problems. Something rotten in games media. There's been something wrong, or rather many things wrong, in games media for some time, and it goes back a long way. Games media used to be either a hobby press or a house organ. Magazines, back when these kind of things were in print, were either glorified catalogues for their parent company or enthusiast press, not dissimilar to any other niche interest hobby. Early games writers were drawn from the hobbyists who constructed computers with no real agenda and a pragmatic view towards games. Did they work? Were the graphics good? Did they show something cool that the computer could do? Were they fun? That was pretty much the extent of their interest in it. Once gaming in and of itself became more of a thing, you began to see specialist games reviewers. These were perhaps a bit more discerning. These kind of reviews began with breathless enthusiasm, turning to more cynicism and humour in their observations going into the 90s. This was also the period in which the companies established their press to talk up their products and act as spokesmen for them. Something else began to happen as we moved into the 2000s. By 2010, the games press was starting to fill up with ideology and snooty judgment. Gamers were having a hard time getting the objective game reviews, meaning subjective but about the game rather than social issues, and were increasingly finding themselves alienated from their own press. It was frustrating, especially once the media started to side with the censor critics, and this built a tremendous amount of resentment up towards the press and the people they were toadying up to. But this was also the period, the 2000s, in which financial corruption began to creep in seriously. Companies wielded their direct and indirect financial muscle to demand better reviews and to ensure cooperation by games media outlets. Failure to cooperate would mean the loss of early access and advertising revenue. Lost access meant fewer exclusives and a delay in news, fatal in the immediacy of the internet. This was probably the first factor in the emerging problems with games media. The age of the internet meant disruption to existing revenue models, magazine sales and advertising, and placed much more emphasis purely on the advertising side and the necessity for quick action. These rendered game sites highly vulnerable to manipulation by companies and also had a secondary effect, the need for clicks to feed advertising. This led to the increased importance of controversial articles, and few things drew more clicks than making people angry. There was no better way to anger gamers than to judge them, tell them off, and to attack the things they loved. This doesn't explain all of the rot, though. I speculate that there is something else at work. Many of the newer games writers seem to be of a like type, frustrated journalism degree holders or those with wobbly humanities degrees. They're looking for work, looking to apply what they've learned, and they seem to fall into games media via an interest in the internet and new media. I suspect that there is a measure of frustration and annoyance. There's a desire to make a difference of some kind, to apply what they learned about critical theory and activism, and yet they find themselves faced with an indifferent, even hostile audience. The audience just wants to know if games are any good or not. They don't want to be lectured, they don't want to feel guilty, and they don't want to have the real world dragged into their fantasy space. At the same time, you have issues around the games media regarding nepotism and corruption. Payola has long been the case, and sponsorship has been at the status of self-parody for years. While this was derided and criticised, it became the accepted status quo. Everyone knew review scores were nonsense. Everyone knew that pay-for-reviews and other nastiness was taking place, and so everything was taken with a grain of salt. The corruption and nepotism that triggered Gamergate was at a whole new level of hypocrisy, however, especially coming from journalists who had previously decried the existing state of corruption. Here we had reporters sleeping with developers and PR people, financially supporting each other, sharing homes, and otherwise being thoroughly entangled with each other. This was more personal, this was petty, and this was politicized. It was coming from hypocrites who had expended lots of time and effort decrying gamers and games and alienating themselves from their audience. People who had presumed to tell gamers that they were better than them were proven to be anything but. Hypocrisy is all but guaranteed to whip people up. Gamergate's politics. Almost since Gamergate's advent, it has been characterized as some right-wing reactionary movement. This has never been true. Gamergate had people involved in it from all across the political spectrum, but it was primarily a left libertarian grouping. The basis for much of Gamergate's objections to social justice warriors and what they were trying to do through the game's media and the corruption that ensued comes from that left-wing small L libertarian focus, if anything. Left-wing values tend to be egalitarian and anti-hierarchical, while social justice warriors tend to be feminist rather than egalitarian and seek to establish a hierarchy and forms of social control. Where libertarians want the minimum necessary intervention, the regressive left seems to want to legislate and enforce thought crimes, and to determine not only what you can't say, but what you must say. Left libertarians tend to see censorship, for whatever reason, as a regressive step, and they tend to value an open marketplace of ideas. These left libertarians are much more tolerant to opposing ideas, dissent, debate, dialectic, and are perhaps the real inheritors of liberal and Enlightenment ideas and values. Journalist Brad Glasgow conducted a more professional investigation into the political attitudes present in Gamergate, and is apparently also working on a book about Gamergate to show this point of view. His is a much more neutral position than mine. I suggest you read this book once it is out. He has, however, released some of his findings already online, and it's worth summarising some of these. Gamergate self-identified overwhelmingly as liberal or centrist. American Gamergate members overwhelmingly voted for Obama or not at all. British Gamergate members mostly either didn't vote or voted for Labour or the Liberal Democrats. Over 80% agree that human climate change is real. Over 90% believe marijuana should be legal. Over 2/3 are against the death penalty. Over 90% agree with gay marriage. Over 90% are in favour of abortion. Over 75% are in favour of socialised healthcare. Over 70% agree the gender of a game protagonist doesn't matter. Less than 10% regularly read Breitbart, and keep in mind, Breitbart was one of the only outlets to give Gamergate a fair shake. This is hardly the picture of the sexist, racist, reactionary, conservative hotbed of right-wing bigotry one might have otherwise been led to expect. Certainly there were minorities of hard-right people, and people all over the political spectrum, and they were quite visible. This is, however, a testament to how one or two unifying principles can bring together huge numbers of people from very different mindsets and political positions for the same singular purpose. This is the very lesson that the Occupy movement completely and utterly failed to learn. There are ways in which Gamergate does differ from the more extreme, regressive left viewpoints dominant in academia, games media, and the indie scene, however. Gamergate tended to take a much more meritocratic perspective and to be against positive discrimination on a racist or sexist basis. It did not buy into objectification theory any more than it had bought into the idea that games made people violent. It was skeptical of patriarchy theory and tended to be ruthlessly egalitarian, believing people could and should make it on their own merits, without unequal assistance. These attitudes and the removal of benevolent racism and sexism seem to be enough to be called right-wing. This isn't helped by internet culture's heavy use of irony, sarcasm, dark and un-PC humour. All of these can give an appearance, deliberately at odds with people's values, and made stronger by anonymity. Block bots and echo chambers. The polarization of political opinion is a hot topic, and a lot of people blame social media for worsening it. This is certainly part of it. The algorithms on sites like Facebook and YouTube tend to serve us up material similar to that we already consume. This reinforces our existing self-selection and greatly diminishes our exposure to other points of view. We know, sadly, that only interacting with like-minded people causes people to trend towards the more extreme points of view. Algorithms and selection bias are far from the only causes of this phenomenon. At the more extreme end of self-selection is the increasing tendency to block anyone who disagrees. People end friendships over political or other differences, even when they're quite minor. This seems to get worse and worse year on year, and it takes increasing amounts of effort to seek out and to encounter alternative points of view. This isn't helped by the media abdicating its position on reporting the news and increasingly reporting a news. Fox News is perhaps the most blatant example of this, pandering to the existing biases of their audience. In the UK, the newspaper The Daily Mail is perhaps the most egregious example of this, and both audiences tend to end up with distorted views of reality due to the news that they consume. Similar issues occur with outlets like The Guardian and MSNBC, just on the other side of the political spectrum. Even more sinister has been the emergence of block bots. These are mostly found on Twitter, though versions have appeared about other sites, links and social media platforms. The basic idea isn't necessarily a bad one. You have a list of bad actors on such a site, spammers, trolls, abusive accounts, and that list is propagated so that anyone who uses it can automatically block everyone on that list and avoid encountering those people. So far, so good. Unfortunately, what could have been a useful anti-spam / anti-abuse tool ended up being almost immediately politicized. This goes back before Gamergate and back to Atheism Plus. In that community, during and after the split between the political atheists and skeptic atheists, a user from the first camp called Oolon put together the first popularly acknowledged block bot. Needless to say, for all the talk about it blocking abusers and other troublesome people, it was as much about politics as it was abuse. A huge number of individuals from the opposing camp ended up on the blockbot simply for disagreeing, and all it ended up doing was creating a worsening echo chamber. During Gamergate, something similar happened. Cheap hack and script kiddie Randy Harper put together a similar blockbot, listing anyone who had used the Gamergate hashtag and anyone who followed more than a couple of people who had, guilt by association. It then blocked them for everyone who subscribed to that blockbot. Hilariously, this led to many companies and commercial accounts being blocked, including Kentucky Fried Chicken. Less hilariously, the information about who was on the list was accessible, and they were described as abusers, harassers, and other nasty libelous terms. This was lauded as an anti-abuse tool, but like the Atheism Plus blockbot, it was rather an echo chamber creator and a de facto blacklist, created by an abuser and disgusting human being. Again, this only made things worse, since people who disparaged Gamergate were flooded with refutations, counter-comments and explanations as well as trolls. This meant a great many people signed up to use this list and ended up cut off from accurate or opposing information. This included a lot of media people who had been poisoned against Gamergate ahead of time. They never even had an opportunity to see the truth or to have their minds changed. Even worse, the Independent Game Developers Association, IGDA, endorsed the politicized auto-blocker as an anti-harassment tool, and passively as a blacklist. As it turned out, there were legal issues with these block bots regarding both data protection and libel. I was one of the people looking into potential legal action against both the blockbot and the Good Game auto-blocker regarding the libelous aspect. As a result, there were changes made to both bots, their hosting and wording, in order to avoid the legal implications. Unfortunately, it didn't put an end to them, but it did inconvenience the creators and helped force that change. Other block lists and block bots have continued to proliferate, however. Harper was also the creator of a Twitter bot that spammed out messages to the Gamergate hashtag and superficially appeared to be someone against or clueless about Gamergate, asking questions and engaging with people. I have the dubious honour of being one of the people drawn in by this. I ended up exchanging a handful of messages, 4 or so, with the bot. I engaged with it as I had been engaging with many other people in the tag, trying to counter the negative narratives that were being spread around. I also have the dubious honour of having the embarrassing episode broadcast full strength by Will Wheaton. I guess don't be a dick is aspirational, not actual, as a personal rule. Feminism and men's rights. Gamergate had been caught up in the ongoing and increasing cultural conflict, mainly but not entirely online, between increasingly radical, authoritarian and censorious feminism and the rise of men's human rights activism, MHRA. This was down to a few important factors and places of commonality between the two broad communities. A lot of the interference in games and many other matters have come from a fairly radical, authoritarian fringe of feminism against whom many men's rights groups are aligned. Men's human rights activists have been misrepresented and slandered by the media in much the same manner Gamergate was treated. There's a common cause. Both gamers and men's human rights activists tend to reject identity politics. Hardcore gamers are still mostly men. There is a commonality in a more egalitarian and meritocratic point of view rather than one of positive discrimination. Of course, the participation of MHRAs in Gamergate, while welcomed at a time Gamergate needed allies, didn't help their image in the public eye. MHRAs have long been smeared as misogynistic, traditionalistic, anti-woman and so forth. With Gamergate being similarly spuriously accused of these same things, it made it seem like confirmation to those with existing prejudice against either group. Nonetheless, the alliance seemed to prove fruitful for both parties. Both had crossover with the skeptic community that emerged after the Atheism Plus debacle, and all three groups became very adept at using the internet and alternative media to get their message out, whatever the failings of the mainstream media were. Archly feminist analysis invaded the gaming space and failed to make its points, instead of coming across as a repeat of the satanic panic and violence controversies. Rather than create the change they wanted, it created enemies. MHRAs gained a lot of ground-level support and exposure via the Gamergaters. This appears indeed to have contributed to the visibility and popularity of the documentary about men's issues, The Red Pill. I don't consider myself to be a men's human rights activist for many of the same reasons I don't consider myself a feminist, but rather an egalitarian. There are extremists, though less of them, involved in men's rights. Many of them are, understandably, bitter and twisted over what has happened to them, and are very angry, in a way that overrides the reasoned passion that accomplishes more. I don't like the tone and style of sites such as A Voice for Men. I simply can't feel comfortable alongside conservative or crank men's issues advocates like Philip Davies and Mike Buchanan, even when they do the right thing about men's issues in particular. That said, there are plenty of things within the men's human rights movement that I cannot help but agree with. Family court should be equal. The barbaric practice of infant circumcision should be banned. I would like to see the extension of some manner of reproductive rights to men. I want to see the end of the Duluth model internationally. I want to halt the erosion of men's rights to be presumed innocent. I want to reverse the massive reduction of men completing university, and I want to try and address the balance of male teachers in primary schooling. There are so many genuine problems men face, violence, substance abuse, and homelessness, disproportionately, but the people trying to bring these things up just end up being demonized, and that's not right. Effective protest. Gamergate has contributed to a changing game of online protest, and indeed protest culture in general. This has had a resounding effect on the politics of both left and right, and has been a big part of why Gamergate keeps being mentioned, somewhat unfairly, about Trump's presidential campaign and support. A better example would perhaps be Black Lives Matter. There's little doubt that Gamergate was an incredibly effective protest, continually confounding expectations that it would die or falter. It accomplished many of its goals, and also managed to deal a lot of damage to its enemies. Bad faith journalists were driven out, policies changed, and Gamergate contributed to the death of the website Gawker to the tune of 7 figures. This, the constant bad publicity Gamergate was causing, and the lawsuit with Hulk Hogan conspired together to ruin the site. In the end, it came together to put an end to their clickbait and bad practices. So how did Gamergate do this? How did they make it work? What has been their influence on other protests and their legacy? Unity. Gamergate was able to unify a huge amount of people around 2 issues: the demand for more ethical and community-serving games media, and anti-censorship. Much as people laughed at the idea of actually it's about ethics in games journalism, it was. Every step that their enemies took appeared to confirm that this was an issue, whether by colluding over gamers are dead or misrepresenting the movement as a whole. All of these actions simply showed that games media, and much of the mainstream media, were an ethical desert. Censorship was very much a rallying cry for people of all kinds. Genuine liberal and left people despise censorship. The right wing has found itself on the receiving end of a lot of censorship, and for gamers and internet natives, anti-censorship is in the blood. By focusing on these issues, Gamergate failed to succumb, at least for the most part, in its most active period, to the kinds of divisions that broke up movements like Occupy. Gamergate was able to unite right, left, liberal, libertarian, older, younger, and every other group all over the place, all into one, perhaps 2, causes. That couldn't last forever, of course, and as Gamergate won battles and began to diminish in scale, size, and vehemence, those divisions began to appear. Ethics cucks were dismissed by the relatively small number of conspiracy theorists and far-right people, who ended up splitting off into Gamergate Revolt. Further, the tactics and antics of a minority of participants, like the Ralph retort, and the increasing politicization of media supporters like Milo during the US election, meant the centre eventually couldn't hold. Still, the tactic of staying cohesive and effective for such a long time by focusing on the main 2 issues to the near exclusion of all else worked. By keeping to a consistent and unifying message, Gamergate could try to keep things simple and stay on track. Operation Disrespectful Nod. Games and gamers had already been under attack for a long time, even before Gamergate. Frustration and exasperation had been growing for some time, and they had seen how Twitter mobs and social justice warriors often applied pressure to companies with shaming tactics, boycotts, letters to advertisers, and bad media publicity. Perhaps Gamergate couldn't get the last, given their problems with the media, but the rest they could do and turn back around on the people who had intruded on them. Gamergate successfully adopted enemy tactics, ferociously attacking the journalists who had ethical failings, digging up information on them, finding their conflicts of interest and exposing them. They also took the Gamers Are Dead sites to task, as well as other sites that attacked their subculture and customer base. They informed advertisers that they did not approve and did not want them supporting sites that did this. Some might consider this hypocritical and censoring, but it was turning the enemy's tactics against them and holding them to their own standards, Alinsky Rule 4. In protesting what Gamergate was doing and decrying it as censorship, Their opposition only succeeded in exposing themselves as hypocrites. They could hardly complain about people mobilizing in exactly the same way they had used themselves to push their agenda. Personally, I was never really comfortable with this tactic. I prefer to take and keep the moral high ground if at all possible. I have been the subject of boycotts, albeit based on bad information and lies, and that makes me wary of trying to harm companies, even Gawker, by going after their bottom line. It just doesn't strike me as fair, especially when such action can stem from bad information or moral panics. There is, however, no denying the effectiveness. #NotYourShield. The narrative that Gamergate was entirely made up of white, heterosexual, cisgender men was never particularly convincing, even though that remains the majority market for games, at least in the West. Nor was it clear why this, rather than what they said, did, or wanted, was particularly damning, unless you're sexist, racist, and cisphobic. Still, this was the claim from the start as some way of trying to delegitimize Gamergate as a reactionary wave of racism and male fragility. Needless to say, this frustrated a lot of female and minority gamers who were fully on board with Gamergate, or at least were fed up with white, middle-class college activists presuming to speak up on their behalf. Indeed, this was a striking thing throughout Gamergate. Consistently, the anti-Gamergate groups and speakers lacked in diversity, while gaming events, conventions, and Gamergate itself were a whirlpool of diversity in thought as well as gender, colour, and sexuality. Thought being the one that matters. Not Your Shield was set up as a counter-narrative to these claims that were being made against Gamergate's diversity. Self-identified Gamergaters and others who had minority status spoke up using the hashtag, appealing to journalists and activists to stop presuming to speak for them and to stop attacking a cause that they believed in. None of them took up the challenge, despite continuing to claim to speak for minorities. Of course, immediately after the advent of the tag, it was attacked. It was claimed that this was an operation by 4chan. It did originate on that site, but wasn't an orchestrated fake, and that most of the people posting on it were sock puppets, fake accounts. In fact, the idea of the tag was coined by Polar Roller on 4chan's V-board and tweeted by Ninu90 not long after, before taking off by itself. Not Your Shield was useful in demonstrating that Gamergate was more diverse, especially once people, controversially, felt forced to step away from their anonymity to prove that they were real. This exposed people to increasing attacks, including attacks on their jobs and attempts to dox and threaten them. Not that this got anything like as much exposure as alleged attacks on anti-Gamergate did. The attacks on me certainly didn't get any exposure, at least not of the sympathetic kind. The substantial diversity in all ways of Gamergate stood in opposition to the politics of victimhood presented by their opposition. Minorities involved in Gamergate appeared to want to be treated equally, to be given an equal shot with everyone else. They seemed to value the equal standing that online anonymity gives people, and appeared to see a lot of what Gamergate opposed as being well-meaning idiots, screwing things up that they enjoyed. At the very least, they did not see or acknowledge the supposed racial or gender issues the activists were raising. Many described feeling patronised and talked down to by social justice activists who were treating them in a manner more appropriate to patronising colonialism rather than genuinely wanting to help. There were, of course, people who did fake, who did take advantage, and who did troll using sock puppets. This, as with most things, turned out to be much more widespread behaviour on the part of trolls and anti-Gamergate, but it did happen the other way. Alison Prime, a prominent lesbian member of Gamergate and Not Your Shield for some time, was eventually outed as a scammer. This scammer, Stephen Polk, used his fake identity to get close to women and to try and get money for a home situation that may or may not have been fake itself. He was outed by Gamergate and was proven to be about as real as prominent anti-Gamergater Peter Coffin's girlfriend. Gamergate was always more critical, suspicious and careful about itself and policing its collective behaviour in a way that anti-Gamergate never was. Tag flooding. Being almost entirely cut off from mainstream and games media access, Gamergate had to continually seek out new ways to get themselves heard. This was especially important given the adoption of block bots by general users. Their spread was based on the lie that Gamergate was a gang of harassers and bigots, and the truth was that they did swarm people who mentioned them in order to debunk and discuss. One of the ways Gamergate found to get around this was to hijack trending hashtags, or hashtags used by events on Twitter. Despite heavy usage, the Gamergate tag and related tags, even new ones that were adopted, were often delisted by Twitter under apparent social pressure, reducing their viability. Hijacking tags allowed them to bypass this censorship and probably made things worse than simply allowing the tag to continue to trend and autofill. To be heard, Gamergate would adopt new tags, like rotating a phaser frequency to get past a Borg shield, or it would invade these other tags. Games conventions, tech shows, and popular tags were all hit in this way, flooding them with information, countering narratives, or demanding that attention be drawn to the bad actors in the gaming community. Particular targets were conventions, tech industry, or gaming-related tags, but anything could be hit. One especially effective example came when Gamergate brigaded the tag being used for a conference by the Society for Professional Journalism, the SPJ. The journalists were bewildered and taken aback at this happening, but the SPJ had long been held up as an example of what Gamergate wanted from games journalism regarding ethical standards. There was something of a battle over informing the SPJ of who and what Gamergate was, with anti-Gamergate making some headway in turning them off to the movement and getting many of them to adopt the auto-blocker. The tag flood did, however, manage to pique the interest of maverick journalist Michael Koretsky, who ended up setting up a conference meeting specifically to discuss Gamergate and ethics in games journalism. Airplay. Alternative media. People have tried repeatedly to tie Gamergate to Trump and the post-truth political era. There is one arena in which they may have something of a point, and that is about people's relationship with the media. The events of Gamergate crushed a huge number of people's trust in the mainstream media, whether it be newspapers, national networks, or the online offerings of large companies. This problem with the mainstream media began almost right from the start. The Guardian accidentally leaked an email that demonstrated a bias from the get-go. Guardian journalists were prevented from talking with Gamergate and getting their point of view. Also, Leigh Alexander, a games journalist, increasingly involved in the ethical problems Gamergate was protesting, was invited in to give her spin and to create a narrative. There was no chance for anyone else to present their opinion without that pre-existing bias. When it came to Gamergate, the actions and corruption of the media were a large-scale application of the Murray-Gell-Mann amnesia effect. Briefly stated, this is what happens when we read a news story about something we know and understand. It rapidly becomes apparent to us that the journalist knows little to nothing about what they're reporting on. We scoff, we dismiss what they're saying, but then we turn the page and read the next section, international politics perhaps, and instantly start treating them like they know what they're talking about again. In this instance, however, perhaps due to the viciousness of the attacks and the new status of media as an increasingly partisan, pandering and clickbaiting institution, gamers didn't forget when they turned the page. In generations already turning to YouTube, social media and alternative outlets for their news and information, this was a death blow to their trust in the mainstream. Gamergate managed to make good headway on alternative and minority news outlets, got its message out in this new way, and found that it didn't so much need more traditional media. They also made fantastic use of meme warfare, applying humour, in-jokes and artful trolling to play their opposition for fools and to make them look absurd repeatedly. It is true that the right-wing made up ground in recent years for many of the same reasons. Constant misrepresentations, hostility from and towards mainstream media, the polarization and the loss of the news. It's also true that conservatives have learned to use humour and memes, Pepe the Frog for example, to great effect, and to successfully mock and satirize their enemies. They may well have learned some of this from Gamergate and the anti-social justice warrior movement. They saw its effectiveness perhaps via Breitbart, and the self-promotional success of Milo Yiannopoulos and his association with it. I've been a news junkie since I was very young, and while it has been somewhat heartening to see outlets like the BBC lagging behind the pandering going on in privately owned news companies, they have begun to slide, however, and their youth content and internet offerings in particular have been terrible when it comes to internet culture. There is no option left anymore other than to try and consume as much alternative media from as many different sources as possible. Then, from all that conflicting information, you have to seek to determine for yourself what is true and accurate. That can be exhausting, and for many people, who has the time? That's a dangerous situation to be in. Distributed organization. The idea of a distributed organization without any real leadership is not new. It's an organizational structure that has been used in all manner of resistance movements, dissident groups, and even terrorist organizations for many years. In recent memory, it is yet another element of modern protest that can be traced back to the Occupy movement. Occupy was a decentralized, anarchistic movement with no real leadership. It emerged from a commonality of outrage and took off with the popularity of a cat meme before stumbling and falling apart from too many agendas. Gamergate drew on some of these ideas but was different in significant ways, some of which have already been discussed. One of the most important ways in which Gamergate was different was that it was not only non-hierarchical, but it was also an example of emergent complexity. Gamergate was a comprehensive alliance of people with two chief concerns that united everyone: censorship and ethics. When something got its attention, it would naturally surge towards that issue, like a murmuration of starlings, without the need for leadership. All it needed was quick communication, which was facilitated by social media, especially Twitter, and image boards. Where there was broad agreement on an issue, there was critical mass, and hence action. Where there wasn't, little happened. There were no leaders, but different popular spokesmen and women would rise and fall naturally as they gained or lost support, and Gamergate was very suspicious and wary of leaders and cabals trying to control it. This gave it a degree of resilience and plausible deniability that its opposition always lacked. This, in many ways, made it impossible for its enemies to fight. They couldn't discredit leaders because there weren't any. Gamergate didn't care about toxic views as they were beyond the issues. It couldn't be forced to turn on its own, outside of its own emergent decisions to do so, so much as such a thing could even be possible. For its enemies, this was like trying to nail jelly to a wall. Couple that with Gamergate's vast-scale anonymity, and its enemies were always shadowboxing. The opposition was never sure who or what was real, and even when they got it right, attacks on individual leaders were pointless. This did have its downsides, of course. Anyone using the tag, troll or not, could be labelled Gamergate. Without leaders or spokesmen, the media didn't know how to handle Gamergate. They had no idea who to talk to. Being an anonymous source, unwilling to break anonymity even for media, little wonder in a battle with the media, combined to create a lack of credibility. It wasn't impossible to talk to Gamergate. Both Milo Yiannopoulos and Brad Glasgow managed to solve this problem. The games media had its agenda, though, and the mainstream media was too lazy to put the work in that was necessary. Interestingly, mainstream media understands things about Gamergate that it didn't understand before when it talks about Black Lives Matter. Gamergate was held accountable for every anonymous troll comment, every spurious, untraceable, non-credible threat made in its name, or not. BLM has been forgiven every racist Facebook update, every criminal spokesman, every murder seemingly connected to its name, and chanting about killing police at protests. Whether this represents a political bias or having learned since Gamergate remains to be seen. Pseudo-academia. People look to the populist right-wing rise and assume that this means that society has become more right-wing and regressive. In my opinion, we have seen a rise in extremity on the left in name only, and the alienation of liberals, libertarians, and libertines. Nowhere has this alienation and horror directed at the pseudo-left been more apparent than about academia. For years now, much of it concurrent with Gamergate, we have seen a rise in cultural conflict in and around universities. Controversial issues like no platforming, trigger warnings, and safe spaces have arisen. We have minority students demanding segregation be returned. This time, segregation is somehow supposed to protect those minority students. We have language being characterized as violence, and violence being portrayed as expression, at least when it's used to silence and bar speakers. Once the bastion of the free speech movement, Berkeley in particular, has become a flashpoint for the new censorship movement. Those being attacked might be right-wing, and many of their views might be disgusting, regressive, or simply uncomfortable, but they have a right to free expression just as much as anyone else does. This has long been a left liberal principle, and it's one that seems to have been irreparably compromised. We see an enormous political bias on campuses and a lack of balance of representation of different views, and this monopolar environment has created a degree of extremism. This extremism is most evident and prevalent in the humanities and social sciences, down to the denial of biology, physics, and the scientific method itself. It is from these extreme and unscientific departments, exposed by the SoCal and conceptual penis affairs, that many of the current criticisms of games comes. Disturbingly, this is the prevalent point of view in the emerging field of game studies. In groups like Digra, we see this hostility writ large, not only towards games themselves, but to the scientific method itself via the rejection of peer review and proper methodology. They start from conclusions and select evidence and interpretations to serve that end. This has completely turned off the game audience itself from what could otherwise be a useful field of study. I and others tried to create a journal and an alternative. We wanted something more study-focused with a proper organizational structure to look into games. There was simply no interest. The primary reason? Nobody saw any value in academic study of games, primarily because of the hash Digra and other groups had made of it and the poor standard of their scholarship. These are not scholars or academics, they're activists. They're not there to study, but to try and force change. Sadly, they're having some effect, especially since the games media, and then the games companies themselves, are buying into this. The current crop of hostile games journalists and critics are mostly from this kind of background. They're steeped in postmodernism and gender theory, seeing themselves as people trying to make a difference, hostile to the subject of their own study, with no objectivity, no distance, and massive bias. We're now seeing these problems play out in the wider culture war, especially at universities. To people from the outside looking in, and even to people within universities, it looks awful. This is what other people have known for years. As a game designer myself, I would love for there to be some useful, decent, accurate academic study into games. There's virtually nothing though. It might as well be book reports written by high school students. It's about them and their thoughts and reactions, not the games themselves, not the structure. It's useless from a design point of view, and from the position of free expression advocacy, it's actively dangerous. They're providing fuel, on no scientific basis, for people to attack games and the internet. The United Fucking Nations. A massively important aspect of the power dynamic around Gamergate and the broader culture war is the authority and importance of victimhood status. I first became aware of this, yet again, during the Occupy movement, when the progressive stack was used to determine who got to speak and who didn't. This is a kind of prejudice where people's identity is given a primacy of importance over their eloquence, skill, or ideas. It is the absolute opposite of the philosophy behind image board anonymity, which emphasizes merit and a viciously cruel marketplace of ideas. Essentially, the more oppressed and marginal you are, the more protected groups you fit into, the more right you have to speak and the more weight your words are given. It's also starkly against left-wing philosophy, which advocates treating people equally, not creating special treatment or new hierarchies. Claiming victimhood, claiming marginalization, is perversely an incredibly useful thing regarding both hard and soft power. The irony is that, while the whole concept rests upon the idea that you're powerless and need compensation for that status, you are in fact powerful. The idea is that you need to be granted advantage rather than equality. That's an argument that can be had, and many groups are indeed making these arguments, but it comes down to a battle between those who advocate that equality should mean equal treatment and those who advocate for compensatory inequality. Speaking for myself, I'm an egalitarian. I don't think you can get to equality by pumping more inequality into the system. Certainly in today's world, there are powerful arguments to be made that aspects of discrimination now more adversely affect men, especially in education. There are also arguments to be made that positive discrimination worsens race relations and creates resentment and problems as compared with assistance given on the basis of need. This may have contributed to the populist right backlash and a sense of entitlement and outrage amongst communities constantly being told that they are owed something due to history. Blaming whites, men and heterosexuals for the alleged actions of their ancestors is like a secular version of original sin. People resent it. It certainly doesn't help the pursuit of equality. If you happen to belong to any non-marginalized group, you'll find your opinions being censored, ignored, and you'll find yourself being held responsible for perceived historical wrongs. Are you cisgender? Are you white? Are you male? Good luck getting heard or getting a fair shake, especially if you don't spend half an hour apologizing for that first. This power dynamic narrative also lays behind the Orwellian attempts to redefine terms like racism and sexism to prejudice plus power, rather than simply discrimination on that basis. This is, in fact, a specialized sub-definition of racism used to describe systemic or systematic racism, not racism itself. The facile and shallow nature of this analysis, especially when it characterizes all white people as privileged or holding power, is rendered apparent when you consider that the most racist demographics are the ones with the least power. The whole idea of this oppression Olympics and the power dynamic in question goes from tragedy to farce when you consider how things around Gamergate played out. Who had unfettered and unchallenged access to the media? Who had governmental support? Who continues to make thousands of dollars every month from sympathy donations? Who was invited to meet Google and spread their insane ideas? Who was invited to participate on Twitter's Trust and Safety Council? Lastly, who, absurdly, was invited to speak to the United fucking Nations? These are not powerless, defenseless damsels in distress with no voices and no power, but they trade on that pseudo-scientific sociological analysis, and it simply may not be contradicted, lest you be excommunicated. These are, whether they mean to be or not, useful idiots for those who want to control the digital frontier. Fake news. Fake news has become a sort of joke now, a meaningless phrase used by all sides to dismiss news stories they just don't happen to like. Nonetheless, when the term first emerged, it had some genuinely useful meanings. Firstly, it referred to the genuine cases of actual fake news, constructed stories designed explicitly as clickbait with little or no relation to anything in the real world. Secondly, it referred to the loss of the news being replaced increasingly by slanted, profit-oriented news that pandered to existing bias. Claire Wardell has identified a full 7 types of fake news, historical and current. 1. Satire or parody, no intention to cause harm but has potential to fall. 2. False connection, when headlines, visuals or captions don't support the content. 3. Misleading content, misleading use of information to frame an issue or an individual. 4. False content, when genuine content is shared with false contextual information. 5. Imposter content, when legitimate sources are impersonated with false, made-up sources. 6. Manipulated content, when genuine information or imagery is manipulated to deceive, as with a doctored photo. 7. Fabricated content. New content is 100% false and designed to deceive and do harm. Gamergate was very much a victim of fake news in the forms 2, 3, 4 and 6. The laziness and bias of the media led to a massive and widespread misrepresentation and a shattering of already shaky trust from millennials and grizzled veteran Generation Xers in the news media. That's unfortunate, but it's justified, and that distrust has since spread. Gamers are dead. Gamergate probably would have been a flash in the pan, a mere small skirmish, if it hadn't been for the Gamers are Dead articles. The mass attack by their own media on their hobby and identity was an unprecedented betrayal of gamers by the very people who should have been defending them. It got people's dander up and ultimately helped expose just how rotten, nepotistic and biased the whole edifice of games media was. Gamers Are Dead was a cluster of articles of similar content that exploded across multiple sites swiftly following the advent of the Gamergate hashtag, but apparently put together before that change. They argued broadly that the gamer identity was dead, in part due to the increasing popularity of games out of the hobbyist niche, but mostly because of the misogyny, racism, etc. allegedly present in the gaming community. This was, of course, absurd, akin to declaring that the advent of the summer blockbuster and the chick flick meant that the identity of film buff was dead. The groundless accusations made towards the gaming community were an attack. There was nothing meaningful there. That this came from the same media that, not so many years ago, had united with the gaming community against similar attacks gave it the outrage energy of treachery. The combination of treachery and collusion, initially blamed on Silver String Media but later discovered to be due to Game Journo Pros, was too much to stand. Gamers Are Dead was a breakpoint in a slow-burning tension between the demands of the consumer for decent, impartial games reviews and the frustrated desires of game journalists to make their work more intellectual and relevant. Gamers were tired of being constantly attacked by the likes of Sarkeesian, while games media lauded her and appeared to agree with her wacky analysis, and failed to call her out for her failings. Sarkeesian was only the most visible symptom. Postmodern critical analysis was infecting commentary and even reviews with increasing regularity, and gamers were growing impatient with it interfering with their access to information. You play games to escape. You read reviews and comments to learn about the games, not to be harangued with first-year gender studies analysis or to be proselytized to. Games are a fun pastime. That's meant to make you feel good. It's fiction, an escape. They're not supposed to be a guilt trip. The ringleader of these articles appears to have been writer Leigh Alexander writing for Gamma Sutra, or at least she was the patient zero for these attacks. It's a nasty, squalid little article. It's full of nerd-shaming, which activates a race memory of being bullied and marginalized, that helped it incense gamers who thought we were past that shit, that nerd chic was now a thing. It dismisses online culture that has proven itself to be so powerful since, as a crass, mercantile worship of mammon rather than fanish enthusiasm. It fails, terrible in a supposed enthusiast press outlet, to understand that games are art, culture, and that they genuinely matter. At the same time, the article paradoxically damns them for their deleterious effect in those same arenas. It victim blames gamers for triggering the moral panics against them, while furthering the new sexist moral panic. It unquestioningly, and without investigation, repeats the narrative of harassment and threats against women in the games industry, ignoring the similar attacks on men, and not stopping to ask if it's true, listen and believe. It doesn't acknowledge how open gaming has always been, and particularly how it is now, as Not Your Shield proved. It even bemoans the complaints about poor journalistic ethics, while being an exemplar of those poor ethics, both as an article and in the shape of its writer. This was one of a set of articles conceived in private collusion across outlets, presenting a united attacking narrative. It is a genuine case of fake news, propaganda, a constructed spin on events. Leigh Alexander is ranked number 2 on deepfreeze.it's list of shame, with 23 ethical strikes against her. She double-booked her journalistic career with her work as a games consultant, a clear conflict of interest. She failed to disclose personal and financial relationships with numerous people that she promoted and wrote articles about. She was a member of Game Journo Pros, despite lying about not being on the list. She viciously attacked writer Anne Rice, YouTuber Total Biscuit, and others. She threatened to blacklist people and end their careers. She engaged in and encouraged doxing. She admitted deliberate bias and contempt for journalistic ethics, and has made arguably racist statements while claiming to be progressive and anti-racist. a pattern repeated consistently amongst social justice warriors. This was the person leading the charge against Gamergate? Dismissing their concerns about journalistic ethics in games media? You could scarcely have chosen a worse person to defend games media against the charges being made. I remember reading these articles as they came out. I didn't get angry, at least not so much as many other people did. Rather, I got sad. An enthusiast press should be making informed criticisms of its art form, not attacking it by agenda as these did. To have so many outlets working together to attack their audience, and by extension their hobby, should have been unthinkable. Game Journo Pros exposed. Journalist was a private Google group for journalists, founded in 2007 and closed in 2010 after it was exposed and criticised. This was a list of some 400 journalists, academics and others with a left-wing slant. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, and of course people with shared interests and shared careers talk all the time. The problem, as leaks from it exposed, was it being particularly nasty in its discussion and treatment of its ideological opponents. It was also exposed as being involved in a cross-party collaboration to promote US Democratic Party talking points and perspectives. The news still isn't supposed to be so brazenly partisan, and the list was quietly closed after this exposure. Political commentator Tucker Carlson described what he saw in leaks from the group like this. That is not journalism, and those who engage in it are not journalists. They should stop pretending to be. The news organizations they work for should stop pretending too. This was a pretty big scandal at the time. While there was an argument over what it meant and spirited attempts to defend it, it was ultimately shut down and the alleged practices, at least, were agreed not to be playing the game in the manner that they should. Journalist was the model for Game Journo Pros, the existence of which was first exposed by Milo Yiannopoulos on Breitbart, but confirmed by list member Kyle Orland. Game Journo Pros wasn't as important, of course, being limited to games journalism, but about Gamergate's issues it would prove to be incredibly important. Discussion on the list included talk about using the controversy around Zoe Quinn and ethical issues to give her game more exposure. It also contained pressure to censor discussion of the issue on Sitefora, to spread the ideas behind the Gamers Are Dead articles, and to blacklist Alistair Pinsoff, formerly of Destructoid. It also exposed close links with PR firms and numerous other ethically grey, if not necessarily ethically black, actions. This confirmed what many had suspected and previously levelled at Silverstring Media, that there was collusion, that people were working to create a narrative, and that it was a conspiracy of sorts. It confirmed that there was blacklisting, and that pressure was being used to censor discussion. It showed that the ongoing story of Gamergate was being presented in an entirely one-sided way on purpose. Silverstring Media. Silverstring Media has come up a couple of times now, and it's worth making a quick diversion to explain who and what they are. Silverstring Media is an intensely ideological PR company, heavily tied to a lot of the critics and anti-Gamergate journalists, as well as indie games designers who are broadly part of the same cabal. While not necessarily propagated by them regarding the articles, the Gamers Are Dead concept was one they had pushed in the past. That, along with their games journalist links, made them a leading suspect as a source of collusion, until Game Journo Pros was exposed. Silverstring are frankly terrifying. Their ideological fanaticism is utterly fringe and very deep-rooted. Leaks exposing them were anonymous, but seem to have been confirmed. They included spooky observations, such as, "This PR group Sarkeesian is tied to is fairly creepy, heavily ideological. They hold retreat workshops for SJW concepts with a sharply activist tone. Reminds us of Jesus Camp. They do workshops for game devs where they discuss dismantling hegemonic masculinity in the gaming industry and do weird training activities like state torture Jenga, hegemonic masculinity. It's like they're quoting Gramsci's prison notebooks. Creepy." This is the ideologically biased and absolutist language one expects from a cult, not a PR firm. They're attached to Sarkeesian and feminist frequency, amongst others. Bring back bullying. A seemingly small thing, an example of the bad faith of journalists, blew up in Gawker's face and was the main contributor to Gamergate's part in its downfall. Gawker journalist Sam Biddle tweeted out the following in 2 posts during the dust-up. Ultimately, Gamergate is reaffirming what we've known to be true for decades. Nerds should be constantly shamed and degraded into submission. Bring back bullying. Along with him, fellow Gawker journalist at feminist hate site Jezebel offered a $10,000 reward for pictures of a Gamergate supporter they deigned to fuck. Others began to pile on. This public display of bias and hatred was bad enough, but Biddle turned out to be advocating bullying and harassment during National Bully Prevention Awareness Month. It was a spectacular own goal in a huge number of ways, even more so as more anti-Gamergate journalists and others began to pile on, displaying the very alleged behaviour that they had been criticising Gamergate for. In response, Gamergate donated over $16,000 to an anti-bullying charity, and not long after instituted the Gamergate Harassment Patrol. This took an internal stand against trolling, doxing and harassment, getting a huge number of such accounts banned, amongst other accomplishments. These were journalists who should have been investigating the issues and getting to the truth. Instead, they participated in cheap point scoring and advocated for bullying and social shaming at the worst possible time to do so. Gamergate turned that into aid for a charity and increased its efforts to deal with genuine issues and to confound its false negative image. This was, of course, barely reported. SPJ and airplay. From almost the beginning of Gamergate, gamers were citing the Society of Professional Journalists standards for ethical journalism as a goal, and as examples of how those standards were being breached by games journalists. It was a common talking point, running right through Gamergate. When various outlets did concede to changing or even just enforcing their ethical standards, Gamergate cheered. When the SPJ held a conference and used a hashtag on Twitter to coordinate people who were present there, Gamergate leapt onto the hashtag en masse. They dumped a huge amount of information about what was going on around Gamergate and tried to engage as many people as possible. Many involved with the conference were confused and had no idea what was going on. Others were lied to and encouraged to sign up to blockbots by anti-Gamergate. Some listened. Maverick journalist Michael Koretsky became the most engaged person from the SPJ, excited and happy to see that so many people, many of them young people, were so engaged with the idea of journalistic ethics. Koretsky engaged with the tag, asked questions, listened, then helped to organise a fair shake for Gamergate at a second SPJ conference. A pair of panels, morning and afternoon, called Airplay. The panel participants could have been better chosen, and there was still a comprehension problem on the part of the SPJ, requiring a lot of explanation and background that ate up a lot of time. Still, there was an eventual agreement that yes, games journalists being pointed at by Gamergate were breaching the ethical standards of the profession by having, and not declaring, their incestuous friendships, romances, financial and other ties. Perhaps more interestingly is that despite precautions, forewarning and security awareness, the meeting received a bomb threat. This was not the only time threats and misrepresentations would be used to try and deny Gamergate from meeting. Similar threats were claimed by anti-Gamergate groups. It is likely in both cases that these were third-party trolls, not dangerous. But what was interesting was that only the threats made against Gamergate were considered credible by law enforcement. Despite these disruptions, Airplay went ahead, even continuing outside after the building had to be cleared. People's determination to continue their meeting and discuss the points related to it even drew praise from journalists at the broader SPJ conference, some of whom had been war correspondents. Reforms. Some are dismissive of what Gamergate achieved, but it did accomplish a great deal in cleaning up games media and in changing the environment around games reporting. This is not insignificant. It's worth pausing today in 2017 to consider, in retrospect, what changed. 1. Affiliate links on many sites were forced to be more visible. 2. Disclaimers and corrections were posted on existing attack articles against Gamergate, exposing links, such as those between Jen Frank and Zoe Quinn in a Guardian article. Conflicts of interest and proper disclosures were also flagged up or edited in. 3. Ethics policies were enforced and updated. 4. Gamergate used their opposition's tactics successfully to apply economic pressure to game sites acting in bad faith. 5. Games such as Hatred and Honeypop were protected from censorship. 6. It helped the fine young capitalists complete their goal to help women in gaming. 7. Multiple resignations or retirements of bad faith game journalists noted for ethical breaches occurred. 8. Over $100,000 was raised for various charities. 9. Policies around Patreon and crowdfunding were clarified or enacted. 10. YouTubers and other alternative outlets adopted public ethical policies. Perhaps most importantly and of the most impact, the FTC in America revised its rules regarding affiliate links and sponsored articles, something of importance to all internet users, not just Gamergaters. Beyond even that, there was now an engaged and activated audience of gamers determined to protect the free expression of developers and the rights of consumers. There was now a massive, all-seeing watchdog for the games industry that was constantly looking for any impropriety and putting it on blast. Clickbait and Gawker. The ascent of clickbait seems to have been stalled somewhat as people become more suspicious and more resentful of being lied to. During the main years of Gamergate, however, it was still very much a thing. Few sites were more notorious for pursuing clickbait than Gawker and its collection of subsites, Jezebel, IO9 and Kotaku in particular when it comes to games. Gawker's model was entirely devoted to clicks, and they were willing to ignore laws, accuracy, and even common decency in pursuit of clicks and the advertising revenue that would follow. This would ultimately lead to the downfall of Gawker and the selling off of its assets after losing its legal fight with Hulk Hogan. The clickbait model favours outrage, antagonism, catastrophizing, overstatement, and setting people at each other's throats. It's easier to create a clickbait article that angers people than one that delights them. If you can get two sides fighting, especially in the comments, or linking to your article, whether to support or condemn, your hits and your money are going to go up. In the climate leading up to Gamergate, this attitude, prevalent across internet media and news, was favouring the critics and their spurious claims of sexism, racism, and so forth. So the story was bound to attract annoyed and incensed gamers, but also militant ideologues to defend the accusations. That was a recipe for flame war after flame war and increased partisanship between the two sides. It may also have driven the willingness of individual sites to indulge ideological criticism and attacks on their hobby. There was money in it, and up until Gamergate the mobbing only came from one side. The Gawker-owned, at the time, site Kotaku was very much at the centre of a lot of the early Gamergate issues. At the time it was playing host to Nathan Grayson, the initial source of the conflict of interest in the conspiracy precursor to Gamergate. Kotaku had a long history of clickbait and deliberately controversial articles. It had multiple journalists as part of Game Journo Pros, and it repeatedly attacked Gamergate. Even before Gamergate, Kotaku was hated by many gamers, not only for its seeming ideological bias, but for other actions it had taken. One example was the treatment of Brad Wardell, printing stories about a spurious sexual harassment suit that he was found innocent of, leaving an online trail that continues to cause him issues. Its involvement in the initial controversies, Game Journo Pros, and continuous and ongoing attacks on Gamergate made Kotaku, Gawker, a prime target for Gamergate, and the main site to be targeted and harmed by Operation Disrespectful Nod. Gamergate's detractors have cited the attacks on Gawker and Kotaku via their advertisers as a case of hypocrisy by Gamergate regarding its anti-censorship position. While I had concerns about boycotts and going after advertisers in this way for that reason, that doesn't seem quite so applicable when it comes to Gawker and Kotaku. While there were ethical issues on other sites that were targeted, some of them were relatively minor. Unlike those, Kotaku tended to make excuses for behaviour such as Grayson's and had to be forced harder to introduce ethical standards. As a part of Gawker, they were also tied up into illegal activity as well as ethical breaches. In these cases, it's not really what is being said, and not so much a free speech issue, but a moral, ethical, and legal failing, against which sanction would seem to be more justified. Media stupidity. Another huge problem with the media, and one that became ever more apparent through Gamergate, was that they simply didn't know what they were doing or saying. There was no real understanding of internet culture. There was a reliance upon the word of the games media. There was virtually no effort to reach out to Gamergate, and they repeatedly took everything that they were told at face value by Gamergate's supposed victims. Not only that, but they were repeatedly and successfully, spectacularly trolled. Something that goes on to this very day, and even happens on gaming-related sites, which, if anyone at all, should know better. Gamergate may have been the beginning of awareness about this, but it has since reached absurd heights. The apex, so far, of not getting it was the furore over Pepe during the 2017 US election. A simple cartoon frog turned into many memes was transformed into a hate symbol by nothing more than the paranoia and stupidity of the American left, turning them into figures of fun. Trolls further managed to confuse news outlets into believing that the OK hand gesture was somehow a white supremacist symbol, and this trend has only continued. Perhaps one of the best examples of this related to Gamergate was the case of Virender Jubal. Virender was a game critic vocal against Gamergate and also noteworthy for a high volume of racist anti-white tweets. When Paris was attacked, trolls photoshopped a picture of him and circulated it, including some Gamergate supporters claiming the image was one of the attackers. Bad taste, perhaps, but the media picked up on it and circulated the image uncritically, despite it being a rather obvious Photoshop, despite him being a Sikh, and despite a great big dildo having been photoshopped into the background. This not only punished Virender for slandering gamers and his racism, but it also exposed the media's amateurishness, and, as this prank was accused of being racist, laid bare the hypocrisy of many social justice activists. I remember trying to engage with Jabal in my usual fairly reasonable but uncompromising way, trying to call him on his inaccuracies and racism. I was blocked in short order, a pattern we see throughout these discussions. Gamergate versus Revolt versus Baphomet versus Trolls. When it suits them, the media can discern between extremists, breakaway groups, and the main body of any particular movement. Also, when it suits them, they are completely unable to do this self-same thing. This largely depends on their political slant, as we run into it on the regular media. If your group seems acceptable, you'll get more leeway than otherwise. For example, right-wing media and talk radio will leap on any opportunity to connect Black Lives Matter with threats to and attacks on police. They will also look for any excuse to dismiss such accusations made against lone wolf far-right shooters. In reverse, the left-wing media will look for any excuse to dismiss Islam as a cause for terrorism and will blow up the smallest far-right incident far beyond the relative scale of its seriousness. Both sides will use individuals to tar holes when it suits them, and excuse the whole from actions of minority subgroups when they prefer. As an amorphous leaderless movement, a hashtag and set of fora in which just about anyone could post, it was easy for bad actors to masquerade as Gamergate. That isn't to say that there weren't bad actors in Gamergate, just regarding sheer scale, it's almost certain that there were, but this is true of just about any large-scale group. Most of the time people understand that these fringes do not represent the whole, unless they have an agenda to push. The fact that trolls, that anyone could use the tag, did give Gamergate's enemies plenty of ammunition, even if it wasn't truly Gamergate. That at least would take a modicum of skill or effort to decipher, a couple of clicks to look at someone's profile perhaps, but there were other instances that underlined the media's lack of understanding, just as previously groups like Anonymous were referred to as 4chan. In the case of Gamergate, whole boards, 8chan in this instance, were accused of being Gamergate. It became rapidly apparent that the media couldn't understand the nature of image boards, or that different sections were essentially different communities, albeit with some crossover. Accusing a whole board because of one bad actor in one subset is like arresting everyone on a street because one guy at number 12 turned out to be a terrorist. There was a dedicated attack board on 8chan called Baphomet, which was devoted to genuine harassment and doxing. This was not in any way the same as the Gamergate boards on that site, yet was repeatedly cited as evidence of Gamergate-based harassment. Evidence was that they and other trolling and attack groups were going after both sides, fairly indiscriminately, though targets guaranteed to freak out were more frequent on the anti-Gamergate side. Similarly, when outcast by the rest of Gamergate for their actions and craziness, Gamergate Revolt was set up. It was a tiny splinter of far-right and conspiracy theory nuts that were no longer part of the movement. Still, their insanity and bad actions were used to smear Gamergate as a whole. These were the people who referred to the majority of Gamergate, fixed on the real concerns of censorship and ethics, as ethics cucks. You can find the sad remnants of their group on Endchan. The mix of activism, ignorance and laziness was extremely harmful to the mainstream image of Gamergate, and more broadly should make us all concerned about the quality of our news. If media outlets are relying on Wikipedia, getting one-sided points of view and making assumptions without investigation, how can we rely on their information about anything? It has become something of a game now to lure the media into believing something nonsensical and taking it seriously. During Gamergate's battles with its opponents, both the media and those opponents grasped at every straw to try and discredit Gamergate as a hate movement. One of the more egregious examples of this was Jace Connors. Connors, a rather unfunny internet comedian of the cringe variety, posted an unhinged YouTube rant directed against anti-Gamergate personality Brianna Wu. Wu, of course, took this seriously, or pretended to, and parts of the media followed her cue. It was such an obvious troll it begged belief that anyone would take it seriously, but it was far from the only one. Other figures had taken, and continued to take, the Navy SEAL copypaster as a serious threat against their life. These mistakes are a source of hilarity to those who know and understand the internet, like Gamergate, but with so many people being unfamiliar with internet and gamer culture, many take these things at face value. The internet may be part of broader culture now, but it's still its own space, with its own rules, memes, and ways of expressing itself, and it is vulnerable to being misunderstood by those not steeped in that culture. There's also a big difference between people who use the internet and people who live there. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.